They called him Egg Boy. Every single morning, before the first bell, that name bounced off the lockers, sharp, cruel, and relentless. Egg Boy, over and over, until it didn't even sound like a name anymore. It sounded like a sentence. He'd walk through those crowded halls with his head down, pretending not to hear. But he heard. He heard everything. The laughter, the whispers, the way people moved aside, like his pain was contagious. Sometimes, he wondered if they even knew his real name, or if to them, he was just a joke in a jacket 2 sizes too big, a kid without parents, an easy target. One morning, the taunts turned physical. A shove, a tray flying, and then the sound, an egg cracking against the floor. The cafeteria roared with laughter as yolk dripped down his shirt. That's when the nickname stuck forever. Egg Boy. He wanted to scream, to fight, to make them all feel the humiliation burning inside him. But something held him back, something deep buried under the anger. A voice, faint but stubborn, whispering, "Not yet." Because what no one in that hallway knew, not the bullies, not the ones who laughed, not even the teachers who looked away, was that this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning, a story about rage, about fire, about learning that true strength isn't found in the swing of a fist, but in the moment you decide not to swing at all. So before you scroll away, listen closely, because somewhere out there, maybe in New York, Chicago, Houston, or Los Angeles, someone's living this story right now. Maybe you've lived it, and maybe, like Egg Boy, you're about to find out what happens when you stop running from the fire and learn to control it instead. High school was supposed to be a new start. That's what everyone said. A chance to leave behind the old wounds, the quiet stares, the memories of being that kid. But life doesn't hand out clean slates. It just paints over the scars, hoping no one looks too closely. When I walked into Ridgeway High for the first time, I didn't want to stand out. I kept my head low, backpack tight on my shoulders, eyes on the floor tiles. The hallways were a maze of laughter and noise, sneakers squeaking, lockers slamming, a rhythm that felt alive, but not welcoming. You can always tell when you don't belong. It's in the way people glance at you, not out of curiosity, but calculation, like they're trying to decide which part of you they'll break first. My mother said, "Just focus on your books. Ignore them. It'll pass." But she didn't know what it's like to be the punchline before you've even spoken a word. That morning, the cafeteria was a storm of noise, trays clattering, laughter bouncing off tiled walls. I stood in line, staring at the eggs on my plate. Scrambled, lukewarm, dripping oil. I didn't even like eggs, but they were cheap and I was hungry. I took a seat in the corner, the kind of spot people use when they don't want to be seen. I thought I was invisible. But that's the thing about high school. Invisibility is a myth. Someone's always watching. Across the room, a group of boys was laughing too loud. You can recognize trouble even from a distance. There's a rhythm to cruelty, an effortless, rehearsed tone that makes you its next line. Troy was at the center of it. He had that easy smile, the kind that people mistake for charm, not knowing it hides something sharp underneath. He wasn't the biggest kid or the strongest. He didn't need to be. Power in high school isn't about strength. It's about attention. And Troy owned it like currency. I tried not to look at him, but his eyes found mine anyway. Just a flicker at first, like he'd spotted something worth poking at. Then that smirk. The one that says, "I've already decided who you are." He said something to the others. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't need to. They laughed. Then they stood. The first time it walked toward me, it was almost slow, casual, confident, like predators stretching before a chase. My stomach dropped, and for a split second, I thought about running. But where would I go? You can't outrun what follows you in every hallway. The footsteps stopped beside my table. One of them nudged my tray with his boot. The eggs trembled, slid slightly, then steadied. I didn't move. Another leaned down, inspected me like I was an exhibit. He said something I didn't process. I just remember the laughter that followed, sharp, collective, rehearsed. Then it happened. A single egg rolled off my plate, hit the floor and cracked. The sound echoed, somehow louder than it should have been. The cafeteria froze for half a second. Then someone laughed, not loudly, but just enough to start the chain reaction. Dozens joined in. Some pointed. Someone whispered, "Egg boy." And just like that, the name stuck. It spread faster than a rumor. By the next class, people were already saying it in the halls. By the end of the day, it was written in marker on my locker, EGG boy. Big, uneven letters, dripping with ink and cruelty. You don't forget the first time a word becomes your cage. That night, I went home and scrubbed the stain from my shirt. The smell of egg wouldn't leave. No matter how many times I washed, I could still feel it. The slick, sour reminder of humiliation that had turned me into a joke. I didn't tell my mom. She had enough to worry about. 2 jobs, unpaid bills, the constant hum of exhaustion in her eyes. So I stayed quiet, pretended it didn't matter, pretended that I wasn't counting the minutes until morning with dread. But it did matter, because the next day, it got worse. They found new ways to make it hurt. Sometimes it was small things, a shove in the hallway, a tray bumped from my hands, whispers behind my back. Other times it was louder, chants echoing down the corridor. "Egg boy! Egg boy!" Always laughing, always watching. Every joke chipped away at something inside me, something I didn't even know could break. At first, I told myself it was just words. But words cut deeper than fists, because fists bruise the body. Words bruise the soul. There's a point where humiliation becomes its own kind of silence. You stop speaking, not because you can't, but because you know no one's listening. Teachers see, but they look away. Friends hesitate, but fear isolation more than compassion. So you shrink. You learn to walk smaller, breathe quieter, hope that invisibility might work this time. But invisibility is a lie. They always see you. I remember the day it turned physical. It was a Friday. The air was heavy with the smell of rain. That strange, electric tension that warns you something's coming. I was walking to class, clutching my books, trying to keep my head down. And then a shove. Book spilled. Laughter erupted. Troy stood there, grinning, holding another egg in his hand. He tossed it once, caught again like it was a game. The crowd around him started chanting. That word again, egg boy, each syllable a spark on dry wood. He stepped closer. I froze. He lifted his hand, and before I could move, the egg hit my chest. It exploded, yolk and shell sliding down my shirt. The crowd howled with laughter. Something inside me cracked. Not like the egg. Quieter, deeper. For a moment, I saw red. My fist clenched. Every instinct screamed at me to fight back, to swing, to make them bleed the way I was bleeding inside. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stood there, drenched in humiliation, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out their laughter. And in that frozen second, I realized something. Anger is heavy. It burns hot and fast, but when it fades, it leaves ashes where your strength used to be. I walked away. Every step felt like carrying a mountain. Behind me, their laughter chased me down the hall, echoing through every corner of my mind. That evening, I found myself staring into the bathroom mirror. The shirt was ruined, stained yellow, reeking. But that wasn't what I saw. I saw a stranger, a kid who looked tired, hollow, someone who had stopped believing that tomorrow could be better. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me. Was it weakness? Or did they see what they feared most? Someone who refused to break completely? I didn't know then, but humiliation does more than hurt. It shapes you. Like pressure on coal, it decides whether you'll crumble or harden. But that transformation doesn't happen overnight. At first, all you feel is the ache. For weeks, it didn't stop. Every morning, there was a new note in my locker. "Hey, egg boy, drop your breakfast again? Careful, don't crack under pressure." Sometimes, it was drawings, crude sketches of me holding eggs. Other times, they'd whisper when I passed, just loud enough to hear. I became a ghost, walking halls filled with voices that weren't mine. And yet, something strange started to grow beneath the pain. A quiet fire. Small. Hidden. Not the wild kind that destroys everything it touches. but the kind that waits, that plans. I didn't want revenge. Not really. I just wanted to stop feeling powerless. So I started watching. Not them, but myself. How I reacted. How my heartbeat changed. How my breath shortened when I felt their eyes on me. I started to see the pattern. They weren't feeding off my weakness. They were feeding off my reaction. Every time I flinched, they won. Every time I looked away, they grew bolder. So I tried something new. I stopped reacting. The first day, it was hard. My hands trembled, my stomach twisted, but I stayed silent. The second day, their jokes lost a little edge. By the end of the week, I noticed something. They didn't laugh quite as loud anymore. That's when I realized something no one had ever told me. Strength isn't about winning fights. It's about refusing to let someone else dictate your peace. Still, peace doesn't come easy. Not when you're haunted by memories of laughter. Not when your mind replays every word, every look, every crack of the egg hitting your chest. There were nights I'd wake up sweating, hearing their voices in my dreams. Nights when I wanted to disappear. But there was also a part of me, small, stubborn, that refused, that whispered, "Not like this. Not yet." Looking back, I think humiliation was my teacher, cruel, merciless, but honest. It showed me who I was when the world decided I was nothing. It showed me the gap between who I wanted to be and who I'd become. And maybe that's why, when I met him later, the man who'd teach me about control, I was ready to listen. Because before you can learn strength, you have to understand what it means to feel small. Before you can control fire, you have to know what it feels like to be burned. And I was burned, deeply, but beneath those ashes, the fire waited. That afternoon, I sat at the edge of town, waiting for a bus that never seemed to come. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like it. Each drop that lingered on my jacket felt heavier than it should have been, as if the sky itself shared my exhaustion. I wasn't really waiting for a bus. I was just waiting. For what? I didn't know. Maybe for something to change. Maybe for someone to notice that I existed at all. The world moved past me. Cars hissing over wet asphalt. People laughing on their phones. Umbrellas closing and opening like small shields against everything outside. And there I was, alone, sitting under a flickering streetlight, trying to swallow the lump in my throat that had been there all week. Every bruise on my arm, every echo of laughter in the hallway had built up to that moment. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to make the world feel as broken as I did inside. But I just sat there, motionless, hollow, staring at the puddles collecting my reflection. That's when I heard his voice for the first time. Calm, deep, like the kind of voice that doesn't speak to be heard, but to be understood. I didn't look up right away. There was something about the way he spoke, not demanding attention, but inviting it. And when I finally turned, I saw him, an older man, gray hair tucked beneath a worn cap, jacket faded, eyes sharp but gentle. He looked like he'd lived a dozen lifetimes, each one etched quietly into the lines of his face. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. He just stood there, studying me the way someone studies a storm cloud, knowing it's dangerous, but also knowing it can bring rain the earth needs. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He simply sat down on the bench beside me, silent, unbothered by my presence. We didn't speak for a while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though it felt intentional, like he was giving me space to breathe. After what felt like hours, he said, "Rage is a fire, powerful, but it burns you first." The words hung in the air like smoke. They didn't feel like advice. They felt like confession. I didn't respond, not out of disrespect, but because I didn't trust myself to speak. My throat was tight, my heart still heavy with every insult I'd endured. So I just stared at the ground, letting the words echo in my mind. A fire. Yeah, that's what it felt like. Burning inside me, growing hotter with every shove, every cruel laugh, every whisper of Egg Boy down the hallway. I wanted to ask him how he knew, but something told me he'd been there before, not in a school hallway, but somewhere darker. You can recognize that kind of pain in someone. It sits in their posture, their tone, the way they look at the world like they've already forgiven it for being cruel. The bus finally arrived. He stood, brushed off his jacket, and nodded toward me. That simple gesture, it was an invitation, just a quiet acknowledgement that I had a choice. I didn't move. I watched him step on, watched the doors close, watched the bus disappear down the street. For a long time, I sat there, replaying his words over and over. Rage is a fire, powerful, but it burns you first. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't sleep. His words had settled somewhere deep where sleep couldn't reach. I left home before sunrise, walking without direction. Somehow, my feet carried me back to that same bus stop. And there he was again, sitting in the same spot, reading a newspaper that looked older than both of us. He glanced up, gave a small nod, and went back to reading. I sat beside him without saying a word. Another quiet moment stretched between us, the kind that doesn't need filling. He didn't ask why I came. I didn't ask what he was doing there. But after a while, he folded his paper, set it aside, and said softly, "You came back. That's good. Most people run from what they need." He looked at me again, those steady eyes pinning me in place. "You look angry," he said, "but not at me, at yourself." I swallowed hard. He was right. I was angry at everything, but mostly at myself for not being stronger, for not fighting back, for letting them make me egg boy. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small coin, and rolled it between his fingers. "Anger," he said, "is like this coin. Both sides look different, but it's still the same piece of metal. On one side is destruction, on the other, discipline." He flipped the coin, caught it midair, and held out to me. "Which side you land on depends on control." I didn't take it. I just stared at it, realizing he wasn't talking about the coin. He was talking about me. He smiled faintly and pocketed it again. Then he stood, looked toward the rising sun, and said, "If you ever want to learn how not to burn, come find me." He walked away, slow and sure, leaving me with nothing but the sound of his boots fading into the distance. Days passed. School didn't get easier. If anything, it got worse. Troy had a new game now, pushing just hard enough to make me react, but not enough for teachers to notice. He wanted me angry. He wanted me to lose control. And each time I felt it, that heat rising in my chest, that pulse in my temples. The fire. One afternoon, after another shove, another laugh, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran, not away, but toward something, toward that bus stop. He was there, of course, almost like he'd known I'd come, like he'd been waiting. I stood in front of him, fists trembling, words breaking through clenched teeth. "Teach me?" He didn't smile. He just nodded once and said, "All right, but understand something first. I don't teach you how to fight. I teach you how not to." And that's how it began. He lived on the edge of town, in a small workshop that smelled of wood and oil. It wasn't fancy, just old shelves lined with books, a cracked window that let in morning light, and a single punching bag hanging from the ceiling. The kind of place built for solitude. He never told me his name, and I never asked. Names didn't seem to matter there. He wasn't my teacher in the traditional sense. He was something else, a reminder that even broken things can be repurposed. The first lesson wasn't about fists. It was about breathing. He told me to close my eyes and listen, not to him, but to myself, to the sound of my heartbeat, to the rhythm of air moving through my lungs. At first, it felt stupid. How could breathing stop the pain? But the longer I stood there, the more I noticed how fast my thoughts ran, how shallow my breath became whenever I thought of Troy, how every memory of humiliation tightened my chest. He said, "You can't control the storm outside until you learn to quiet the one inside." For hours, I stood there, eyes closed, breathing in, breathing out. The first day, I felt nothing. The second, I started to feel the difference, the space between anger and action. By the end of the week, I understood control wasn't silence. It was choice. He told me a story one evening, the one behind that faint scar on his hand. He'd been young once, like me, quick to anger, quick to fight. He'd let that fire consume him. convinced that violence made him strong. But one night, his rage didn't just hit the man who'd wronged him. It hit the woman who tried to stop him, his mother. And from that night on, he carried the weight of what anger had cost him. He said he'd vowed never to fight again, not until he understood control. And now, all he wanted was to pass that understanding to someone else. So maybe they wouldn't make the same mistake. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. But in that silence, something shifted. For the first time, I saw anger not as power, but as poison, one that eats an inside out. Weeks turned into months. Training wasn't about punches or kicks. Not yet. It was about awareness. About learning the distance between emotion and decision. He'd make me hold a stance for minutes, sometimes hours, until my legs trembled. Not to build strength, but patience. He said the body learns stillness before it learns motion. When I failed, he didn't shout. He'd just say, again. And I would. The world outside didn't change. Troy still taunted me. The whispers still filled the hallways. But I was changing. Inside, the fire that once controlled me was now something I could watch, observe, even harness. It didn't own me anymore. Not completely. There were days I wanted to test it, to walk into school and show Troy that I wasn't the same kid he broke. But the man's words echoed in me. Rage is a fire. Control the flame or it controls you. So I waited, and I learned. Each lesson carved a new truth into me. That strength isn't loud. It's quiet, measured, and it doesn't always win battles. Sometimes it prevents them. I realized then that fighting wasn't the point. Becoming unshakable was. One evening, after training, I asked him something that had been eating at me. I said, what if control isn't enough? What if they keep coming? He looked at me, calm as ever, and said, then you endure, because the storm doesn't last forever, but who you become after it does. That line stayed with me. It still does, because endurance isn't about ignoring pain. It's about refusing to let pain dictate who you are. From that day on, every breath I took, every step I made became deliberate. Even when I returned to school, I carried his lessons with me. The hallways didn't feel like cages anymore. They felt like tests. Each laugh, each whisper, each shove was another chance to practice control. To prove to myself that I was no longer the boy they mocked. Sometimes, control felt harder than fighting ever could. It demanded more strength to walk away than strike back. But that's what he'd been teaching me all along. Not how to defeat others, but how to master myself. And little by little, I did. The day came when I walked through that cafeteria again. The same tables, the same faces, the same laughter. But something had changed. Not them, me. They tried again, of course. The jokes, the names. But the words didn't stick anymore. Because when you know who you are, no one else can tell you otherwise. I wasn't Egg Boy anymore. Not because they stopped saying it, but because I stopped believing it. Sometimes, life sends us teachers in disguise. Not in classrooms, not behind desks, but in moments when we're too broken to see clearly. He didn't just teach me discipline or restraint. He taught me to see strength differently. To understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is nothing at all. Control isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about directing it. It's standing in the middle of chaos and choosing stillness. It's looking at the fire and saying, I decide where you burn. And though I didn't know it then, everything he taught me, every breath, every pause, every moment of silence, was leading me towards something bigger. A test I didn't know was coming. A test that would show me what kind of man I was becoming. Because the fire inside me hadn't disappeared. It had only learned to wait. And soon enough, the world would try to set it free again. But this time, I'd be ready. The days after the promise felt heavier than the ones before. The world didn't stop mocking him just because he had vowed not to fight. The laughter still echoed in the halls. The names still cut deep. Yet something had changed. Something small and visible, but real. A seed of restraint had been planted. Every morning, he woke before dawn. The sky outside his window was pale gray, the color of waiting. The streets were silent except for the hum of distant cars, And in that stillness, he began his ritual. At first, it was just breathing, slow, deliberate, like a man learning to exist again. He would sit on the cold floor, eyes closed, counting the seconds between his breaths, teaching his heartbeat to obey reason instead of rage. The mentor had told him that control starts with stillness, that if he could master a single breath, he could master 1,000 storms. It sounded foolish then, but as the weeks unfolded, the boy began to understand. His body became a mirror of his mind, both bruised, both learning. He started training in an abandoned warehouse near the edge of town, where light slipped through broken glass like strands of gold. The air smelled of rust and rain. Here, there were no witnesses, no laughter, no names. Only the sound of his fists meeting the heavy bag, the dull rhythm of effort and release. Each punch carried a memory. Each strike was a confession, a silent way of saying what words could never express. But the mentor had made one rule. He could never hit in anger. If his mind wasn't calm, he had to stop. So the boy learned to pause mid-swing, holding his fist in the air until a tremor of fury left his bones. That pause became his teacher. It taught him patience. It taught him presence. The first week was agony. He wanted to explode, to break something, to remind the world he wasn't weak. But the mentor's words followed him everywhere, a whisper behind every impulse. Rage is a fire. It burns you first. So he kept training. Push-ups until his arms shook. Running until his breath tore through his chest. Balance drills on cracked concrete until his legs trembled. Yet beneath the sweat and pain, something extraordinary was happening. The noise inside him was quieting. The insults still came, but they didn't stay as long. They slid off like water. There were days when he faltered, when Troy's laughter returned like a ghost in his ear, mocking him even in silence. On those days, the boy's reflection became his enemy. He'd stand before the mirror, his hands balled into fists, staring at the person he used to be. The one who wanted revenge, the one who thought strength meant making others afraid. He would look into those eyes and whisper, "Not yet." Time began to blur into routine. School, training, study, sleep, a rhythm that left little room for pain to grow. But pain is persistent. It always finds cracks to crawl through. One afternoon, while leaving class, he heard Troy's voice again, low, mocking, daring. A shove against his shoulder, laughter trailing behind it. The crowd that gathered wasn't as loud as before, but their eyes were the same, hungry for chaos. For a split second, the boy's breath caught. His knuckles whitened. Every hour of restraint trembled at the edge of collapse. But then he exhaled, long and slow. The laughter around him blurred into distant noise. He turned away and walked down the hallway, not out of fear, but because he finally understood what real power looked like. It wasn't in domination. It was in discipline. Yet that victory was fleeting. That night, as he trained, a storm rolled in. Rain hammered against the metal roof, drowning out his breathing. Each drop sounded like the laughter he tried to forget. His punches grew harder, sharper, faster. His control slipped. He hit the bag until his knuckles split, until pain replaced thought. And when he stopped, panting in the dark, he realized what scared him most. Not Troy, not the bullies, but himself. The fire inside him wasn't gone. It was only waiting. The mentor found him there, exhausted and bleeding, the air thick with frustration. The boy said nothing. He didn't need to. The old man's gaze was heavy but kind. He had seen this before, the battle between control and chaos. He cleaned the boy's wounds in silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. The next morning, training began again, but something was different. The boy approached each motion with reverence, as though each movement carried meaning beyond muscle. The punches slowed. The breathing deepened. He began to move like water, flowing, unbroken. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about understanding the storm within. Days turned into weeks. The bruises faded. His posture changed. His eyes, once filled with fear, now held quiet certainty. The whispers in the hallway still came, but fewer now, their power dimming with each act of restraint. The mentor started giving him lessons beyond the body. He spoke of silence as strength, of humility as armor. The boy learned to listen to himself, to the world, to the rhythm of things unseen. One evening, they stood by the river at sunset. The water glowed orange, mirroring the fire in the sky. The boy watched the current twist around stones, powerful yet never breaking form. He realized that control wasn't the absence of power. It was power mastered. But temptation, like the tide, always returns. A month later, the school announced a charity boxing event, open to all students. The crowd would gather, cameras rolling, cheers echoing. When Troy signed up, the boy's heart clenched. The idea of facing him again, legally, publicly, without consequence, lit the old fire inside. The temptation was intoxicating. For nights, he wrestled with the thought, wasn't this justice? Wasn't this his chance to prove he wasn't weak? In the quiet of his room, he replayed the humiliation in his mind. The egg cracking, the laughter, the shame. His body remembered every bruise. Revenge whispered like a friend, promising peace through victory. But deep down, he knew that peace built on pain would never last. The morning of sign-ups, he walked past the gym doors, his name unspoken. He didn't need an audience anymore. The mentor's lessons had shifted something fundamental. He no longer trained to fight others. He trained to master himself. Still, temptation lingers even when resisted. A few days later, fate decided to test him once more. It was after school, when he found Troy cornering a younger kid behind the bleachers. The scene was too familiar. Fear in the boy's eyes, laughter from the aggressor. Time slowed. The air grew heavy with memory. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to end it once and for all. His fist tightened. The fire roared. But he didn't move. Not yet. He watched, calculating, searching for the space between impulse and intention. Then, with a calm he didn't recognize as his own, he stepped forward. The bully froze. For a brief moment, silence claimed the world. The older boy's smirk faltered, replaced by uncertainty. There was something different about Egg Boy, something steady, unshakable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to pull the air from scene. Troy turned away first. The moment passed. The younger student ran. And the boy stood there, heart steady, realizing he had done more with silence than fists ever could. That night, he returned to the warehouse. Rain began to fall again, softer this time, almost cleansing. He stood in the center of the floor, eyes closed, letting the drops trace the scars on his hands. For the first time, the fire inside didn't feel like a curse. It felt like warmth, controlled, purposeful. He had faced the two great enemies of the spirit, rage and temptation, and he had survived both. In the weeks that followed, the world around him didn't transform overnight, but something subtle had shifted. The whispers in the hallway quieted. The laughter lost its edge. People began to notice the calm in his eyes. Not defiance, not fear, just a quiet certainty that unnerved those who once fed on his weakness. The mentor saw it too. He no longer corrected the boy's stance or breathing. Instead, he simply watched, nodding in quiet approval. The lessons had taken root. The fire was no longer wild. It was disciplined, like a blade sharpened by time and patience. Yet mastery is never complete. Some nights, he would still wake with clenched fists, the ghost of old anger twitching in his sleep. But now he knew what to do. Breathe, release, remember. Control wasn't destination. It was a daily choice. And with that choice came freedom. Freedom from the voices. Freedom from the need to prove. Freedom from a boy who once believed violence was the only language power understood. The transformation was quiet, but profound. The world still saw Egg Boy, but inside he had become something entirely different. Forged by fire, tempered by restraint. He had found strength not in fighting others, but in conquering himself. And though the journey ahead remained uncertain, one truth had crystallized within him, a truth that would guide every step that followed. Real power is not in what you can destroy. It's in what you can endure without breaking. The sun rose higher that morning, spilling light through the cracked windows of the warehouse. Dust floated in the beams like tiny sparks. The boy lifted his hands, the scars gleaming faintly, a reminder of battles fought within. He smiled, Not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned to live above it. The fire within him no longer sought to consume. It sought to illuminate. And in that quiet, radiant moment, Egg Boy ceased to exist. What remained was someone stronger, someone who had walked through humiliation, temptation, and rage, and emerged not untouched, but transformed. The world had given him a name meant to mock. He had turned it into a symbol of rebirth. The storm outside passed, leaving behind clear skies. The mentor watched from afar, knowing his student no longer needed guidance. Control had become instinct. And though new challenges would come, as they always do, he was ready. Because once you learn to command your own fire, nothing outside you can burn you again. The morning of the confrontation began like any other, yet the air carried a strange stillness, as if the world itself knew something was about to change. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, gray and swollen, their weight pressing down on the school courtyard below. Wind whispered through the fence, scattering leaves across the cracked pavement. Beneath that gray silence, a storm waited to be born, not in the sky, but in him. He had woken early that morning, unable to rest. The night before, he had tried to convince himself that this day would be like all others. Another day to walk past the taunts. Another day to keep control. But his reflection in the mirror betrayed that lie. The boy staring back at him wasn't the one who flinched anymore. He stood taller now, his eyes calm yet fierce, like a soldier who had already chosen his path. The bruise from last week had almost faded. The scars on his knuckles had hardened. His breathing, once erratic and shallow, had steadied into rhythm. He felt the fire inside him flicker, controlled, but alive. It was no longer rage. It was readiness. As he walked through the school gates, whispers followed. Eyes turned. They still called him Egg Boy, but something in their tone had changed. It wasn't laughter anymore, it was unease. They could sense the shift even if they couldn't name it. He had walked these halls 1,000 times, shoulders tense, avoiding every gaze. But today his stride was even. His eyes didn't dart away. The noise of the crowd faded into background hum. By the lockers, Troy and his friends stood like they owned the place, confident, careless, loud. The leader of their pack leaned against a metal door, tossing an apple from hand to hand. The smirk was the same, the arrogance untouched. But the boy approaching them wasn't the same one they remembered. When Troy saw him, that familiar grin spread across his face, the grin that once made his stomach twist. The bully stepped forward, blocking his path. The crowd noticed immediately. Students began to gather, circling, drawn to the scent of conflict like moths to a flame. Phone cameras appeared from pockets. A chant started, low, rhythmic, familiar. Egg Boy, Egg Boy. The sound rippled through the crowd, but this time it didn't pierce him. It washed over him like a wave meeting stone. Troy took a step closer, puffing out his chest. The apple fell from his hand, rolling between their shoes. The silence stretched thin. The boy's pulse thudded in his ears, but his breathing remained steady. He remembered the mentor's words. Rage is a fire. Control it, or it consumes you. The bully's voice broke the silence. Come on, he sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Let's see the tough guy. The crowd leaned in, phones raised higher. Every eye was on them. Every breath, every heartbeat belonged to that moment. The boy didn't answer. He simply looked at Troy, not with anger, not with fear, but with clarity. His silence unsettled the other boy more than any threat could. The absence of fear was disarming. Troy shoved him once, hard. The impact echoed in the still air. The crowd gasped, expecting the explosion that had been building for months. But nothing came. The boy didn't react. He just steadied himself, breathing through the sting, his body relaxed but firm. Another shove followed. Still no reaction. Only that same calm gaze, unshaken. The tension in the air grew unbearable. The crowd's anticipation turned restless. They wanted violence. They wanted release. But what they got was silence. Silence that felt heavier than any blow. Troy's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Doubt flickered in his eyes, then quickly vanished behind bravado. He swung a fist, fast and reckless, a blur of anger and insecurity. But the boy was faster, Not because he was stronger, but because he was present. He moved with purpose, sidestepping the strike with effortless precision. The punch sliced through empty air. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bully stumbled forward, his balance broken. The boy didn't counter. He didn't need to. He simply straightened, his breathing calm, his expression unchanged. He could have ended it right there. Every muscle in his body knew exactly how. But he didn't. He looked down at Troy, who now glared up on the ground, humiliated, his pride shattered more than his body. And for the first time, the boy saw him differently. Not as a monster, not as an enemy, but as a mirror of what he could have become. Someone ruled by his own rage. Around them, the crowd's laughter changed. It wasn't cruel this time. It was uncertain. The spectacle they wanted had turned into something they didn't understand. The boy turned away. His heartbeat slowed. His chest rose and fell with calm purpose. He wasn't running. He was releasing. Each step away from the scene felt lighter, cleaner, truer. He didn't need applause. He didn't need revenge. The victory had already happened inside. Behind him, Troy shouted insults, desperate to regain control. But the words fell flat, swallowed by the silence the boy left behind. For once, the power didn't belong to the loudest. It belonged to the one who had mastered his fire. As he walked through the courtyard, whispers followed again, but this time they weren't cruel. They were curious, admiring, confused. The same crowd that once laughed at his pain now looked at him with quiet respect. Not because he fought back, but because he didn't have to. The mentor watched from a distance, standing just beyond the chain-link fence. He had seen enough. The test was complete. The lesson had taken root. In the quiet that followed, the school seemed different. The noise that once defined it felt distant, muted, almost fragile. He realized something then. Control isn't the absence of anger. It's the ability to face it without letting it steer you. And in that realization, he understood what strength truly was. Later that day, as the final bell rang, the courtyard emptied. The boy remained on a bench, alone, watching the wind sweep dust across the pavement where the fight had nearly happened. The crowd had moved on, the noise replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves. In that silence, he felt a peace he had never known before. The mentor approached quietly, his footsteps measured. He didn't speak right away. There was no need for words. He simply sat beside him, watching the horizon fade into amber light. The boy's hands were still, his breathing steady. There was no trace of rage, only calm. The old man studied him for a moment, then nodded once, a gesture of quiet pride. For weeks, he had waited for this day, knowing it would come, knowing that true control is only proven under fire. The boy broke the silence first, his voice calm, almost distant. "I didn't fight," he said. The mentor smiled faintly. "You did," he answered softly. "Just not with your fists." The boy turned that over in his mind. For the first time, the word fight didn't feel violent. It felt sacred. It meant something deeper, the struggle within, the battle for mastery over one's own flame. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the mentor rose and placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a teacher to a student, but as one survivor of rage to another. "The fire," the old man said quietly, "will always be there. What matters is what you choose to do with its light." And then he left, disappearing into the fading light. The boy stayed behind, watching the shadows lengthen across the courtyard. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The humiliation, the pain, the temptation, the silence. Every insult, every bruise, every tear had been a piece of the forge that shaped him. He realized that strength wasn't something you earned by breaking others. It was something you discovered when you refused to break yourself. The next morning, the school was quieter. The laughter that once haunted him had softened. Even the air felt lighter, as if the building itself had taken a deep breath. Students who once mocked him now looked away when he passed, not out of guilt, but out of a wordless respect. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. As for Troy, he didn't return for a few days. When he finally did, he avoided eye contact. The swagger was gone. The smirk had dimmed. Something in him had changed too. Maybe shame, maybe confusion, maybe the first small spark of reflection. Whatever it was enough. The cycle of cruelty had broken. The boy didn't gloat. He didn't seek revenge. He simply moved on. Every morning, he still trained, not to fight, but to remember. He would wake before sunrise, the world still half asleep, and breathe through the silence. Each motion, each stance, each breath was a prayer to the balance he had found. The world still tested him. Small provocations, quiet doubts, but he met them with the same stillness he had learned. The fire within him no longer roared. It hummed softly, a living force of focus and strength. Months passed. Seasons changed. The name Egg Boy faded, replaced by whispers of something else, not mockery, but admiration. People started coming to him, not for fights, but for advice. The same hands at once clenched in rage now opened to lift others. Yet he never forgot. He never forgot the sound of the egg cracking, the sting of humiliation, the lessons of control. They became his compass. His silence became his language. His peace became his armor. One afternoon, as he walked past the same hallway where it had all begun, he paused. The walls were covered in new posters, new faces, new stories. But beneath it all, he could still hear the faint echo of laughter from months ago, the ghost of who he used to be. He smiled, not out of bitterness, but gratitude, because without that pain, he would have never found this version of himself. At the far end of the hallway, he noticed a small group of younger students surrounding a boy whose lunch had fallen to the ground. The boy's hands trembled, his eyes wide with embarrassment. The crowd was beginning to form, laughter ready to rise. And then he stepped forward. No one spoke. The laughter stopped before it started. The crowd parted without a word. He knelt, helped the boy pick up his things, and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. No speeches, no lectures, just a quiet act of grace. The crowd dispersed, confused, thoughtful. The younger boy looked up at him, eyes shining with a kind of relief words couldn't capture. In that small moment, the fire that once consumed him became something else entirely, a light for someone else's darkness. That evening, as the sun fell behind the rooftops, he found himself once more at the warehouse where he had trained. The place was still, the air thick with memory. The punching bag hung motionless, dust gathering on the floor. He stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of what had been and the freedom of what was. He didn't train that night. He didn't need to. He just sat on the cold ground, breathing, the faint sound of the city outside blending with the rhythm of his heart. In the distance, thunder rolled, not threatening this time, but familiar, a reminder that storms always return. Yet he knew now that he didn't need to fear them. The fire within him was no longer his enemy. It was his guide. Somewhere far away, the mentor probably smiled, knowing the journey was complete. The boy had faced his fire and walked through it without burning. And though the world would never know the name of the one they once mocked, the lesson he carried would live quietly in every choice, every act of restraint, every moment of grace that followed. Because true power isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or seek revenge. It's quiet, patient, unbreakable. The boy who was once called Egg Boy had finally learned that real strength is not about how hard you can hit, but how deeply you can endure without losing your humanity. And so, as the lights of the city shimmered in the night and the echo of rain filled the air, he closed his eyes and let the fire rest, burning steady, bright, and forever within. The noise had faded. The air moments ago filled with shouts and laughter now carried only the sound of the wind brushing across the courtyard. He stood there, still calm, breath steady, surrounded by the silence he never thought he would earn. For a moment, he didn't move. His fists were still trembling, not from anger now, but from the raw power of holding it back. He could feel the fire inside him, the same one that used to roar out in frustration, now tamed, alive but contained. The crowd didn't know what to do. Some whispered. Others stared, waiting for something explosive that never came. Even Troy, the boy who had made his life miserable for months, stood frozen. The smirk that usually twisted his mouth had disappeared. There was confusion in his eyes, maybe even fear, but also something deeper, recognition. Egg Boy! The name that once echoed to the halls like a curse had changed its meaning. In that moment, it wasn't an insult anymore. It was a story, a symbol of someone who stood up without striking back. He turned slowly and began to walk away. Each step felt heavier and lighter all at once. Heavy with everything he had carried, light with everything he had finally released. Behind him, the crowd split like water parting around stone. No one said a word. No one dared. He didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. He just needed peace. And for the first time, he had it. He walked through the hallway, the same one that used to feel like a battlefield. The lockers were still there, dented, scarred, marked with years of teenage wars. The fluorescent lights still flickered with that annoying hum. The same faces still passed by, but something was different. The whispers didn't sting anymore. The laughter didn't bite. Because somewhere deep inside, he had built something they couldn't touch, a quiet strength that didn't need to be seen to be real. He remembered what the mentor once told him. Rage is a fire, powerful, but it burns you first. He had thought those words were just wisdom passed down from someone who had already lived through his storms. But now, walking through the same halls that once broke him, he understood. It wasn't about pretending the fire wasn't there. It was about learning how to live with it, how to make it a light instead of a weapon. Days passed, then weeks. The world didn't change overnight. The bully still existed, though quieter now, unsure. People still whispered behind his back, but their voices carried less weight. He began to notice things he never had before, small acts of kindness he used to overlook. A classmate who used to laugh now nodded respectfully when they crossed paths. A teacher who once ignored him now smiled with quiet understanding. And once, when Troy dropped his notebook in the hallway, he didn't kick it or curse. He just picked it up and kept walking. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close. He still trained every evening. Not because he wanted revenge, but because discipline had become his language, his way of remembering who he wanted to be. The garage behind his house, once a place where anger exploded, had become a sanctuary. Each push-up was a conversation with his past self, each breath a reminder of how far he'd come. Sometimes, when the air grew heavy with silence, he could almost hear his mentor's voice again. Control isn't weakness. He would close his eyes, nod, and whisper into the quiet, "I know, not anymore." And for the first time, he believed it. One late afternoon, he returned to the park bench where they had first met. The mentor and the boy, two strangers bound by pain and potential. The old man wasn't there. Only the empty seat remained, worn and cracked by sun and time. He sat down anyway. The air was cool. The leaves rustled softly. Somewhere in the distance, kids were laughing. Not the cruel laughter he remembered, but the innocent kind, free of judgment. He smiled faintly. He had once thought laughter was his enemy, the sound of his humiliation. But now it was just another sound, harmless, human. It didn't belong to his past anymore. It belonged to the world, and he was finally part of it again. He looked at his reflection in the glass window of a nearby store. For months, he had avoided mirrors. He didn't want to see the boy they mocked, the one who carried shame like a second skin. But the reflection staring back at him now was different. Not perfect, not unscarred, but stronger. The eyes were calmer. The posture steadier. The fire was still there. He could feel it, but it no longer consumed him. It fueled him. He realized something profound in that moment. The fire within him had never been the problem. It was a direction he gave it that mattered. Anger, fear, pain, they were all part of him, but they no longer defined him. He wasn't Egg Boy the victim anymore. He wasn't Egg Boy the outcast. He was simply himself, and that was enough. The seasons changed. Winter came, quiet and gray. He spent long evenings walking home under streetlights, his breath visible in the cold air. The city seemed gentler now, though he knew it hadn't really changed. He noticed the way people hurried less when they weren't afraid. He noticed how silence could be comforting when it wasn't filled with shame. He noticed that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought in the open, but inside one's own mind. And he had won his. The last day of school came faster than he expected. Students filled the halls with laughter, plans, and farewells. He walked past the same lockers that had once held his pain, but this time his steps were light. He wasn't escaping anymore. He was leaving. As he reached the school gates, he paused. The building behind him wasn't a place of suffering anymore. It was a chapter, closed but not forgotten. He turned once, looked back, and whispered softly, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude for the pain, but for what it had taught him, for showing him who he truly was when the world tried to tell him otherwise. Then he walked away, carrying nothing but peace. In the months that followed, life moved on as it always does. But something inside him remained unshakable, a quiet conviction that no amount of cruelty could erase. He learned that strength isn't built in the moments of victory, but in the hours of restraint. When your body wants to strike, but your soul chooses to rise. He learned that sometimes walking away isn't losing. It's choosing what kind of person you want to become. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, because the moment he stopped fighting for others' approval, he began fighting for himself. The boy who was once mocked, broken, and humiliated had become something extraordinary, not because he fought back, but because he didn't, because he chose to master himself instead of destroy another. He understood now that real courage isn't loud. It's not in the punches thrown or the shouts that fill the air. It's in the stillness, the silence that follows when you decide to be better, not bitter. He carried that lesson with him everywhere, through new schools, new friendships, new beginnings. And even when life threw new challenges his way, because it always does, he faced them with the same calm fire. He had learned how to turn pain into purpose. And purpose, once lit, doesn't fade. There would always be people who misunderstood him. There would always be those who tried to bring others down to lift themselves up, but he no longer feared them, because you can't hurt someone who's made peace with their scars. He walked through life differently now, not in defiance, but in quiet assurance. He had seen the worst of himself and chosen to build something better, and that was power. He began helping others in small ways, a quiet word to someone sitting alone, a reassuring nod to a kid being pushed aside, not because he wanted recognition, but because he knew what it felt like to be unseen. He didn't need to be a hero in the world's eyes. He just needed to be a reminder that healing is possible, that strength can be gentle, that control is not weakness. Years later, when he would look back, he would barely remember the names of the bullies, but he would remember the lesson. He would remember the fire. He would remember the man on the bench, his mentor, and the scar that spoke louder than words. He would remember how that scar wasn't just a wound, but a map showing where pain ends and wisdom begins. And he would smile, knowing he had followed that path faithfully. There's a moment that comes for everyone, a turning point where you decide whether to let your pain define you or refine you. He reached that moment in a schoolyard surrounded by laughter and hate. And by choosing restraint, he rewrote his story. He realized that being Egg Boy was never really an insult. It was a beginning, because every cracked shell reveals something stronger beneath. The sun dipped below the horizon that evening, bathing the streets in orange light. He walked slowly, head up, eyes soft. He had no destination, only a direction. Forward. He knew life wouldn't always be fair. He knew new battles would come, and new pain would find him. But he also knew he would never face it the same way again. Because once you've learned to master your fire, the world can't burn you anymore. We all carry fire inside us. Some let it burn the world around them. Others learn to light their way. So the next time someone calls you weak, remember, control takes more courage than rage ever will. And with that, the story of the bullied boy, the boy who learned to control the fire within, quietly lives on,